Hello, my name is Francis Fukuyama, and I'm pleased to be doing this special course for Tokyo Metropolitan University. The topic we're going to address today is the war in Ukraine and the shifting dynamics of power in Asia and what implications that has for Japan. I am a political scientist and senior fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and I've had a long interest both in Asia and also in the politics, the geopolitics of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So for the course today, we're going to be talking about four different issues. I'm going to begin with the significance and the origins of the current war in Ukraine. I'm going to then shift to the implications of that war for Japan. The third topic will be Japan's strategic interests and U.S.-Japan relations. And finally, we're going to talk about some of the complicating factors in the year 2025 and how that might shift these very fluid outcomes at the present moment. So let's begin with the significance and implications of the Ukraine war in general, and then we'll move to how it applies to Japan in particular. I'd like to say a little bit about my own personal involvement with Ukraine. My center at Stanford University, the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, has been running leadership programs for mid-career Ukrainian professionals to prepare them to take an active role in Ukrainian democracy. We have been doing this since 2013-14 because at that moment we realized that there would be a big global struggle over democracy, and all the way back in 2014 we felt that Ukraine would be one of the front lines in that battle. And so I've been to Ukraine many times in the past decade. The pictures here I took on these visits, one of them shows a Ukrainian soldier that lost both legs to an FPV drone in a battle last year. That's in the upper left. In the upper right is a young woman who is a Crimean Tatar. Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula from the Ottoman Empire under Catherine the Great in the late 18th century. And the Crimean Tatars are descendants of the population that was there at the time. They've suffered greatly under Russian rule. Stalin exiled the entire Crimean Tatar population to Siberia, and they were allowed to come back only in the 1950s. And for that reason, they're actually very patriotic Ukrainians, because it was only when Khrushchev transferred Crimea to Ukraine that they had a little bit more freedom in their ability to live as a separate community. And then finally, the picture at the bottom is the Maidan. This is the central square in downtown Kiev, where the Revolution of Dignity really got its start, when people were called out to that square to protest the alignment of Ukraine, the proposed alignment of Ukraine with Russia. And so I feel that I have a very deep connection with the democratic movement in that country. So the Russia-Ukraine war matters in a number of ways. First of all, globally, it's really the first major cross-border attack that's occurred in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And indeed, if you look at great powers since 1945, you don't find similar instances of this kind of naked aggression. The intention of Russia was to capture and hold territory, take it away from Ukraine, and therefore it has violated a very important international norm that has been in existence really among great powers since 1945. The full-scale invasion that occurred in February 2022 was actually the culmination of a series of aggressive moves that the Russian Federation has taken. This began with the seizure of about 20% of the territory of the Republic of Georgia back in 2008. It included intervention in the Syrian civil war, where Russia was able to send troops to Syria and to protect the Assad regime in a rather extraordinary way after 2010. And then in 2014, you had the seizure of Crimea and moves on the eastern Donbass that occurred that year. And really, the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war should be dated not from 2022, but from 2014 when the Crimean seizure occurred. So to do a little bit of a very superficial history of Ukraine and Russia, it's important to point to certain dates in the history of these two countries. Ukraine was really the original location of the so-called Kievan Rus. This was a settlement on the Dnieper River that many Russians regard as the origin of their history. This occurred in about the 9th century. The region was converted to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries under a number of kings like Volodymyr and Yaroslav. The Kievan Rus was really destroyed by the Mongols, who invaded in the 13th century. This was following on plague and disease and a lot of displacement, where that original settlement was largely destroyed. In the 17th century, there's an incident that Vladimir Putin refers to repeatedly, where a certain leader named Bogdan Khmelnytsky decided to align with Russia against Western powers like Poland, which at that point was part of a large kingdom of Lithuania. Then in the 20th century, you had the Russian Revolution in 1917 that initially led to the first Ukrainian independent republic. That lasted only for a period of 3 or 4 years, from 1917 until 1921, when the Red Army reoccupied Ukraine and incorporated Ukraine into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Another really critical historical moment was in the 1930s, the Holodomor. This was a famine that was deliberately engineered by Joseph Stalin, in which millions of Ukrainian peasants died of starvation because of forced collectivization. And it was only in 1991 that a referendum was held in December in which a vast majority of Ukrainians voted to become independent of the former Soviet Union and of the Russian Federation, and to set up their own state. And the modern independent Ukrainian Republic exists from that point. I'd like to say a little bit about Ukrainian national identity, because this is one of the things that's being contested in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Vladimir Putin and many other Russians around him deny that Ukraine is a nation. They point back to historical moments like a Ukrainian leader that aligned with Russia in the 16th century as showing that actually the Ukrainians don't have a separate national existence. But you have to keep in mind that national identity is basically what a people want it to be. It's not based on these historical precedents from centuries ago. And in 1991, an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians said that they did not want to be part of either the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics or of the Russian Federation, that they wanted to have their own country. And I think the ferocity with which they are fighting indicates the depth of that commitment. Now, there were some dilemmas. Before the full-scale invasion in 2022, the country was divided. You have a lot of Russian speakers that live primarily in the eastern part of the country, in the Donbass. In the western part of Ukraine, there's more Ukrainian spoken. That part of Ukraine at different points had been part of either Poland or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so they had more contact with the West, and so you did have a linguistic division in the country, although many people speaking Ukrainian also are perfectly fluent in Russian. You also had some religious divisions. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church split after the war, and the Ukrainian branch of it broke off because they did not like the way that the patriarch in Moscow had aligned with Putin to try to crush Ukrainian statehood. And in addition, there's a unit or the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church that exists in Western Ukraine that is aligned with the Pope in Rome rather than with the Orthodox Church. And it was very important in fighting for Ukrainian independence when Ukraine was occupied by the Germans during the Second World War. So I think that Ukrainian national identity was really solidified after the full-scale invasion in 2022. We might think of Vladimir Putin as the father of the modern Ukrainian nation because his aggression has managed to unify the country in a way that it was really not unified prior to that moment. And that's been reflected in the spread of the use of the Ukrainian language and the kind of elimination of Russian as a spoken language in much of that country. The question has been raised whether the Ukrainians are fighting for sovereignty or for democracy. And I think it's a kind of false dichotomy because you can't have a democracy unless you have the sovereign ability to determine your own institutions and way of life. And so I think most Ukrainians are fighting for both. They want to be a separate country, Ukraine. They don't want to be part of Russia. And what they appreciate about living in their own country is the fact that it's basically a free country. You can criticize the president. You can vote for whatever political party you want. You have the ability to express yourself in a genuinely democratic manner. And that, I think, is what they regard as being very precious. Now, there are a number of theories about the origins of the full-scale invasion, and we're going to start with some that have been advanced by certain people like the political scientist John Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs, an economist, who both argue a version of the theory that Russia was acting defensively. Following the collapse of the former Soviet Union in 1991, a number of former Soviet republics began to petition for entry into NATO, and NATO did indeed expand during the 2000s, came to include countries like the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and so forth. And then in 2008, there was an important meeting in which both the Republic of Georgia and Ukraine asked for NATO membership. In fact, the desire for NATO membership is really written into the current Ukrainian constitution. And people like Mearsheimer and Sachs argue that it was this threat to expand NATO all the way to the borders of the Russian Federation that drove Russia to attack Ukraine and to try to seize Ukrainian territory. They further maintain that the trigger for this intervention was really a CIA plot or some activity by secret services on the western side that at the end of 2013 caused demonstrations to be held in Maidan, the central square in downtown Kiev, that demanded that Ukraine align itself with Europe and with the West. And they claim that this is something that was engineered somehow by NATO countries. I don't think that this is a correct interpretation of the origin of this war. And the primary source, I think, to believe that there was a different narrative was really Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation himself. I don't think that Putin has been reticent about the reasons why he felt it was necessary to launch both the 2014 seizure of Crimea and then the full-scale invasion in February 2022. He said repeatedly that he believes that Russians and Ukrainians are basically one people, or basically there is no such thing as a separate Ukrainian nation or a separate Ukrainian national identity. He believes that this is really always part of Russia, and it was something that was artificially created both by the West and by former Soviet leaders like Nikita Khrushchev that transferred the peninsula of Crimea from Russia to Ukraine several decades ago. He's further made arguments that Ukraine is run by a bunch of neo-Nazis or fascists that are oppressing the Russian speakers in that country. And I think that anybody that spent any time in Ukraine recognizes that this is really a ridiculous argument. Russian speakers at one point probably constituted a majority of Ukrainians. It was not really possible for Ukrainian speakers to suppress them. And in fact, people like President Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, actually is more comfortable speaking Russian than Ukrainian. He's hardly somebody that's going to initiate a genocide of Russians in that country, as the Russians have suggested. And like people like Sachs and Mearsheimer, Putin believes that the Maidan uprising, the so-called Revolution of Dignity, was something that was engineered by American special services, the CIA. And again, there's really absolutely no evidence for this. I happen to know this for a fact because a number of the people that organized the original Maidan Revolution of Dignity are people that have been through our programs at Stanford. We know them very well, and neither they nor we have anything to do with the CIA, with Western intelligence. They simply represent Ukrainian civil society, and especially the young people of Ukraine that really did not want to be absorbed into a separate Russian dictatorship. And so the essence of the conflict is really an ideological one. Russia wants to deny separate statehood to Ukraine, and they want to have their form of government, their form of dictatorship, prevail over a democratic Ukraine. The Ukrainians, by contrast, believe that they're fighting for their basic freedom as a people, their freedom to have their own country, their freedom to speak whatever language they want, and freedom from the kind of centralized police state that has been created in the Russian Federation. So the war developed in many surprising ways. When the Russians began their full-scale invasion in February 2022, many people, including a lot of officials in Washington, D.C., believed that the Russians would be able to roll over Ukraine very quickly. The Americans ordered their diplomats in Kiev to evacuate to eastern Ukraine because they didn't think that the Ukrainians would be able to hold out. President Zelensky did not flee the country. He made this famous speech in which he said, "I don't want a ride, I want ammunition." And the Ukrainians began to fight back. And they fought back in surprisingly determined and really heroic ways, stopping a Russian paratroop attack that tried to occupy an airport north of Kiev, then rolling the Russian initial invasion column back and stopping the Russians. They could not prevent the seizure of more territory in the eastern Donbass, but they did basically stabilize front lines that had really been contested ever since 2014. We're now in the fourth year of this terrible war, and the cost to both sides has been absolutely enormous. It's estimated that sometime this spring, Russian casualties, both dead and wounded, in this conflict have now amounted to over 1 million soldiers and other kinds of combatants. We don't know what the comparable figures are in Ukraine, but they're very large. They're probably, let's say, a third of the Russian total. So the Ukrainians have lost very, very many soldiers in this extremely bloody fight. But despite those losses and despite efforts to hold at least ceasefire talks, the Ukrainians are determined to continue. So I'm now going to move on to the second section of this talk, how the Ukraine war has implications for Japan. I think that there are really two sets of implications. There are short-term ones that we've experienced already, and then there are longer-term ones. The short-term implications are things like the rise in oil prices that occurred in 2022 when the invasion first began, the kind of sanctions that have been imposed by Russia, by Western powers that Japan has participated in. But then there are longer-term implications of the precedent being set for cross-border aggression, which has suggested to many people that China may do something similar with regard to Taiwan. I think we need to set a broader global perspective, however, in terms of the democratic backsliding that has occurred since 2008. And there are a number of dimensions to this. So if we look at figures on the number of people living under democracies, you had a long period from the early 70s up until the early 2000s in which the numbers increased very dramatically. They probably peaked after the fall of the former Soviet Union, and they have been rising over a period of about 3 decades. But then, beginning in roughly 2008, they began to fall, and the number of people living in democracies declined dramatically. The decline in the upper line, so the dark line represents electoral democracies, democracies that hold free and fair elections, and the light-colored line are liberal democracies that observe rule of law as well. And the upper line went down very dramatically in the 2020s as a result of a number of things that included the attack on Ukraine, but also the backsliding in very large democracies like India. Now, the shift away from democracy was really anchored by the rise of two important authoritarian great powers. That's Vladimir Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's People's Republic of China. These countries had been weakened following the collapse of the Soviet Union, but by the early 2000s had turned themselves into economic powerhouses. Obviously, China's position was more impressive than Russia. Russia is really a country whose economic wealth is heavily concentrated in its ability to produce oil and gas, and so it's a very one-dimensional great power. China, on the other hand, has shown itself able to master modern technologies, is competitive in many technologies of the future like electric vehicles, solar power, and a whole range of other high-tech items that Russia has struggled to produce. And under Xi Jinping, China has shifted to a much more internally repressive system in which power is much more heavily concentrated, not just in the Chinese Communist Party, but also in his own personal authority. China used to have term limits on their senior leadership. They would stay in power for 10 years, then step down and turn over the reins of power to other leaders. But Xi Jinping stopped this practice and now is essentially in his third term of leadership with no clear endpoint to his rule. This is something that Putin has done. Putin is one of the longest-serving leaders of any country now having been in power really for over 20 years. In addition, we have the rise of what has been labeled populist nationalism. These are countries that have held democratic elections, have elected leaders that may have a popular mandate in many respects, but have been dismantling the liberal part of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is really a system composed of a liberal part and a democratic part. The democratic part has to do with free and fair multi-party elections. The liberal part really has to do with the rule of law. That is to say, a rule of law that has to be obeyed by everyone, including the most powerful political figures in the country, and things like constitutional checks and balances that restrict the power of individual leaders to violate the rights of their citizens. And in all of these countries, in Brazil, under the former President Bolsonaro, in Turkey, under President Erdogan, in Hungary, under Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and in India, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, all of these countries have seen backtracking on the individual rights that had been at one time much more thoroughly protected. Unfortunately, there's another country that we can add to this list of illiberal democracies, and that is the United States under Donald Trump. Donald Trump was elected in November 2024. I think nobody contests the legitimacy of that election, but since he's come to power, he has acted in illiberal ways, meaning he has not felt constrained by law, and so he's violated the law in many cases in issuing executive orders. For example, he wants to overturn birthright citizenship, which is very, very clearly mandated in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and he feels that he should be able to do this simply by giving an executive order as President of the United States. And there are many other ways in which checks and balances and the rule of law have been eroded ever since January 20th of this year. So now we turn to the question of how this affects Japan, all of these global trends that I have been documenting. And we want to ask a series of questions. The first one is the extent to which values play a role in shaping the international order. This is one feature of the world that has been created since 1945, in which both things like free trade, ability of countries to follow their own sovereign desires, has been the prevalent mode of international interaction overseen by international institutions like the United States and various trade agreements that have been negotiated like the GATT that eventually evolved into the World Trade Organization. And the alternative way of organizing the world is something that is called realism, in which countries actually don't want to build a international order based on basic principles, like a principle of freedom or property rights. They are following a much narrower sense of their own national self-interest, and they don't really divide the world into friends and enemies based on something like ideology. They basically look to the power and the interests of other states and interact with them indifferently on that basis. And the question is how Japan ought to think about its own interests and values. Should Japan seek to preserve a rules-based international order based on some form of international cooperation, international law, or should it act in a realist way in which it aligns with other countries simply based on a narrower calculation of self-interest? Now, another feature of the world today is the changing nature of warfare. And this is something that has been directly brought about by the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. One of the features of warfare that is very different today than it was more than 3 years ago at the beginning of this war is the replacement of expensive platforms like F-35 fighter jets by very cheap and replicable weapons like FPV drones, like Javelin anti-tank missiles, or portable rockets like the HIMARS system. In the early stages of the war, a Russian armored column was really stopped and defeated by Ukrainians using these much lighter, smaller devices. Neither side has been able to achieve air superiority, and one of the consequences is that drones have borne the brunt of conflict along the entire front line between Russia and Ukraine. This is really a remarkable change in the nature of warfare. Each side in this war has been expending tens of thousands of drones, per week, and neither has really been able to move the front lines very far. It is not safe for an expensive armored vehicle to operate under these conditions because it will be hit by a drone. And this, I think, is going to really alter the nature of war in general in ways that will greatly affect a future military conflict in a region like East Asia. The most obvious implication of the Ukraine invasion for East Asia and for Japan obviously has to do with the precedent that Russia set by seeking to grab Ukraine, basically challenging its sovereignty and seizing its territory. China has long maintained that Taiwan is simply a breakaway province of the People's Republic. It has expressed a long-term ambition to reincorporate Taiwan. This is a situation that is largely accepted by the international community, including the United States. The 1992 consensus, the so-called 1992 consensus that in a way codified the relationship, international relationship of China and Taiwan, accepted the fact that they are part of the same country, but the United States has consistently argued that any unification should occur by mutual agreement and not as a result of the use of force. The United States has traditionally been committed to the defense of Taiwan against external aggression. This is a commitment that was repeated by President Joe Biden during his presidency, and there's been a general expectation in Taiwan that the United States would come to its assistance militarily should China seek to take Taiwan through a military move. We don't know actually the extent to which there is a true American public commitment to sending its young men and women to the defense of Taiwan. It is a country that's very far away, that doesn't have an obvious implication for American security. Nonetheless, this is something that has traditionally been one of the many commitments made in American foreign policy. Taiwan has become particularly important geopolitically because it is the home to TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, which is a leading supplier of semiconductors, and indeed at the high end of the semiconductor market, they have the most advanced processes for making the most advanced chips like those used in the kind of data centers used in artificial intelligence. Although TSMC has plants all over the world, many of them are concentrated in Taiwan, and there is a great fear that that capacity might be an object of Chinese intentions and also might be vulnerable in the event that there is actual military conflict in that region. And for that reason, the United States and other Western countries have been seeking to diversify their dependence on Taiwanese semiconductors. TSMC has been building plants in Japan and in the United States in order to reduce its overall vulnerability. A further question we should discuss is whether Japan should care about values like the importance of liberal democracy as a governing principle. There's a number of reasons why a liberal order should be important to Japan. The first one is economic. Japan's past and future economic growth has been tied to the existence of an open, rules-based international order in which it can export and trade with other like-minded countries freely and without interference. That's been the basis of the Japanese economy since the end of the Second World War. There's a political dimension to this also because democracy provides a linkage with other democratic states in Asia. These include not just Taiwan, but South Korea, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and India. And in fact, the Quad, including Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, have been an active unit trying to counterbalance Chinese power in East Asia. In addition, democracy has been important as an underpinning of the U.S.-Japan relationship. The United States has a number of client states that are not democracies. For example, the Philippines, while Ferdinand Marcos was the dictator of that country. But the fact that Japan is a fellow democracy, I think, increases the American interest in the health and the survival of Japan. And I think that we need to consider what a East Asia dominated by China would look like if China were to be reincorporated into the People's Republic, and if the U.S. were pushed out of the first island chain, that is to say, its bases and facilities and allies close to China, the whole of East Asia would be quite different. Japan would not have a lot of friends. China would be able to dictate the terms of trade in economic relationships, and also might be able to exert something like veto power over the political relationships that a democracy like Japan could have with other countries in the world, including the United States, Europe, and India. And so I do think that although democracy is not as central to Japanese identity as it is to American identity, it is still an important consideration in thinking about when thinking about how Japan ought to see its interest in a future conflict. All right, let's now turn to strategic, more narrowly strategic interests on the part of Japan. I think that it's very hard to understand the implications of the Ukraine war apart from the broader context of U.S.-Japan relations. After 1945, Japan, along with Germany, after defeat, ceded, in effect, sovereignty to the United States. The Americans wrote a constitution whose Article 9 prohibited Japan from developing its own military forces. The U.S. extended a nuclear umbrella over Japan so that Japan would not feel the need to acquire nuclear weapons of its own. And this relationship was really codified in the Nixon-Saito meeting in 1969, following the reversion of Okinawa to Japanese sovereignty. And so Japan, in many respects, has been completely dependent on the United States for the major part of its security. Although there have been Japanese self-defense forces, their ability to operate independently is limited, and politically Japan has committed itself to use them only in very narrow circumstances. However, The relationship has been more complex than this because Japan has, or rather the United States has sought to increase the scope of Japanese security interests. The United States has always had broader security interests in other parts of East Asia. For example, during the Vietnam War in the 1960s and early 70s, Japan was an important rear area for American operations in Vietnam. Well, in the 1980s, there was worry about Soviet expansionism after its invasion of Afghanistan. And then in the 1990s, there are other major security threats, including the effort by North Korea to develop and successfully develop a nuclear weapons program. The United States needed to worry about all of these security issues, and beginning really all the way back in the 1960s, began to push Japan to do more than what the United States itself had forced Japan to accept at the end of World War II. That is to say, to build its security forces, to increase its defense spending, and to get more active in security issues outside the immediate Japanese islands. This is something, by and large, that Japan has sought to resist because there is a clear consensus after 1945 that Japan should not be involved in military activities. It should not return to the kind of aggression that it saw in the 1930s. And in addition, I think it suited Japanese economic interests to have the United States pay for the major part of its security so that Japan itself could focus on economic growth and exports. And as a result, the Japanese defense budget always remained below about 1% of Japanese GDP, which was far below the level that the United States was spending in that same period of time. And as time went on, as Japan became more secure, richer, and a dominant player in the economic sphere, there was increasing American pressure for it to adopt a broader outlook in the security sphere as well. Japan's strategic interests with regard to Taiwan have been complex over the decades. It was always interested in building economic ties with the PRC from the moment that the PRC was founded in 1949, but the United States was locked in a Cold War in which the PRC was a major player. The United States did not recognize the PRC as the official government of China. It recognized the Republic of China on Taiwan instead. And Japan, I think, somewhat unwillingly was forced to go along with this and not recognize the PRC. This changed, of course, in the early 1970s after the Nixon-Kissinger shock, where the United States dropped Taiwan and recognized the PRC as the official regime in China. It downgraded the status of Taiwan, and many Japanese at that time felt betrayed by the United States because they had been forced to accept a different outcome, one that was not necessarily optimal from their economic interest standpoint. But they went ahead and restored relations or recognized the PRC a little bit after the United States and began to build a separate economic relationship with it. This also corresponded to a number of important internal debates within Japan. The Yoshida arrangement, where Japan accepted a loss of sovereignty in return for American protection, was not universally popular. Probably the biggest proponent of an alternative vision for Japan's role was Ozawa Ichiro, who wanted Japan to be a quote-unquote normal country, meaning that it was sovereign, it could develop military forces on its own. It would not return to the aggression of the 1930s, but on the other hand, would not be only a semi-sovereign power under the protection of the United States. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was another important figure arguing for a shift in Japan's role. He had a long-standing ambition to either abolish or change the interpretation of Article 9 so that Japan could, in fact, achieve a different kind of sovereignty and real military capabilities. And so in a way, this corresponded to American pressures to build up its own forces. The problem was, of course, that any effort to change Article 9 embroiled Japan in controversies with China and South Korea, whose wartime experience led both of those countries to oppose any effort to move in this direction, any effort to rearm or remilitarize Japan. And as a result, even Prime Minister Abe was not able to formally change Japan's status, but was in effect able to shift Japan's policy to one where military action was easier to contemplate. Now, the biggest shift, I think, that occurred in the 1990s and the 2000s was the rise of China together with the nuclearization of North Korea. China was the fastest growing country in the world for many years over the decades since its economic reform in 1978. It became the second largest economic power after the United States, displacing Japan. And beginning in 2013, with the rise of Xi Jinping, it embarked on a much different kind of foreign policy. Up to that point, Chinese leaders had been content, Chinese leaders like Deng Xiaoping had been content to focus China on its internal economic growth. So they largely settled a number of outstanding territorial disputes with other countries and did not contest foreign policy issues with any of its neighbors. Actually, this occurred even before Xi Jinping, with claims to sovereignty over large parts of the South China Sea. But this became central to Chinese foreign policy after 2013, when China claimed that all of the sea area inside the so-called nine-dashed line was actually sovereign Chinese territory, and that any ship passing through that area was intruding on Chinese sovereignty. This obviously created huge frictions with a number of countries in the region, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, all of which had similar claims to the islands. But China, nonetheless, was not deterred from an island building campaign where they seized a number of low-lying coral reefs, put military bases on them, and took physical control of these areas, which then would put them astride important shipping lanes between Northeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, through which the majority of trade to Asia passed. In addition, you had a very rapid growth of the Chinese military. The Chinese built all aspects, including their conventional forces, their navy, their air force, and their nuclear capabilities. And for a number of years, China has seen the biggest rises of any country in their overall defense spending. At the same time, you had North Korea under a succession of Kims, who were intent on acquiring nuclear capability, which they achieved in the 1990s, setting off a number of nuclear tests, which were then mated to long-range ICBMs that potentially could carry nuclear warheads as far as the west coast of the United States. They certainly had the capability of launching nuclear weapons that could be used against Japan. And so this put particular pressure on Japan and on the nuclear guarantee that the United States had extended, that if Japan were attacked with nuclear weapons, that the United States would use nuclear weapons of its own in retaliation. This made sense as long as North Korea did not have the capacity to reach American territory with its nuclear weapons. But as in the case of Europe, once it acquired the ability to strike the United States directly, many people began raising the question whether the United States would actually fulfill a commitment to defend Japan if its own citizens were being threatened by North Korean nuclear weapons. So all of these contributed to a very different kind of strategic environment where Japan could not simply assume that the region would remain peaceful and that it could continue to operate in the manner that it had through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I should say something at this point about the actual role that Japan might play and the way it might be affected during a conflict between China and the United States over Taiwan. As in previous wars like the Vietnam War, the Korean War, Japan would obviously be a rear area for American forces, but Japan would have to play a much more prominent role if the United States were to successfully defeat and then hopefully deter a Chinese attack on the island. The reason for this is that the closest military base controlled by the United States and Japan is on the island of Okinawa. From Okinawa, you can actually reach Taiwan in a militarily meaningful way, and that means that successful deterrence of China will really depend on Japan's willingness to allow the facilities on Okinawa to be used by the Americans. This includes places like the Kadena Air Force Base and the Marines that have been stationed on that island for many years. Because of controversies over the basing of American forces there, a lot of them have been pulled back. But in a Chinese blockade or an amphibious assault on Taiwan, obviously Okinawa would become a central staging area for any effort on the part of the United States to repel a Chinese aggression. And for that reason, the United States is very likely to directly ask Japan for support for its military forces in the event of this kind of contingency. So let me conclude by pointing to a number of complications that have arisen. The first one actually has to do with the United States and the election of Donald Trump in November of 2024. Donald Trump has broken with American precedents. He is an isolationist. He has vowed to reduce America's involvement in overseas wars. Every American ally has been put on notice that unless they, as Trump put it, pay more for their own defense, that the United States may decide not in the end to defend them. He has also been apparently reluctant to use American force, although he was willing to help Israel in its recent struggle over the Iranian nuclear program. And the question really facing East Asia is whether he would fulfill a commitment to defend Taiwan against Chinese military aggression, either an assault or a blockade. It's really not clear whether he would be willing to do this. I am a little bit skeptical whether he would see the American interest in Taiwan as sufficiently large. A number of people around him have suggested that this is a very distant conflict that doesn't really affect American interest too directly, and he has largely abandoned support for Ukraine, support that the United States had been providing fairly generously during the presidency of Joe Biden. And this sets a difficult precedent for the Taiwanese, who cannot necessarily count on the United States as they had been doing over the past several decades. The other complicating factor is Japanese-Korean relations, or the triangular relationship between Japan and Korea. With the attempted coup by President Yoon and a new election and the rise of a new President Lee that represents the Democratic Party in Korea, you have a Korea that is likely to turn away from the relatively warm bilateral relationship that Korea had developed under President Yoon. This relationship, in my opinion, is actually strategically quite important because Japan and Korea are two democratic allies of the United States. Both are very important and relatively powerful military players. And if there is to be a successful defense of Western interest against China in the Western Pacific, Japanese-Korean cooperation is absolutely necessary. And so people have been looking very closely at the policies of the new president, which traditionally, he represents a party that traditionally has been hostile to Japan over the historical legacy of Japanese colonialism there. And it's not clear that the Trump administration, like the Biden administration, is going to be as consistent in applying pressure on Korea to have a good relationship with Japan and to work with it strategically. So all of these are big uncertainties. We just saw the opening up of a completely new, very brutal conflict in the Middle East. We don't know where that is heading, but certainly that has implications for the price of oil, for supply chains, for many things that pass through the Middle East and from the Middle East into East Asia. And we have an extraordinary amount of internal instability within existing democracies that and among them, most importantly, is the United States. The United States created the liberal international order after 1945. American military power was responsible for the security relations like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, the U.S.-Korean security relationship, and all of these have been thrown into question by a president that seems much more focused on trade deficits than he does on strategic security issues. On the other hand, it's not clear that this American turn towards a more isolationist policy is going to be a permanent one. There are certainly many people in the United States that are very unhappy with any effort to walk away from international commitments like the one that President Biden had made to Ukraine. They want to keep relations with traditional allies like Japan, Korea, and the European countries in the NATO alliance. And at the time of the next presidential election, it's really not clear which of these visions of international relations for the United States is going to prevail. So I think that the bottom line conclusion that I would draw for a country like Japan is that it needs to prepare and think differently about the future. It needs to consider whether a greater degree of self-reliance is important, whether becoming a quote-unquote normal country that can defend itself might not be a much greater imperative. I don't want to really speak directly about the question of nuclear weapons, although this does come up. If the American nuclear guarantee is not going to be as reliable or certain as it was during the Cold War and in the period following the Cold War, then Japan, Korea, countries in Europe are going to have to make their own decisions on how to deal with the ultimate security blanket, which is the possession of nuclear weapons. So this is the situation. The Ukraine war has set off a lot of new discussions about the future of security that at this moment are going to remain uncertain and will be that way for a good period in the future. So I thank you for your attention to this lecture, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions on any of the points that I've covered. Thank you very much.